Welcome to Christian Da'wah. Today we're going to be talking about an issue that I have been mulling over for a long time, and that is, do the prophecies in the Quran hold up, and how can we tell if they do or not? What's our standard for doing that? So this is going to be a bit of a deep dive. I'm here on my comfy couch, sitting beside my beautiful Christmas tree, but if that's something that interests you as well, come and join me. I'm sure it'll be a great time. So I think the first thing we have to address, if we're going to talk about whether the Quranic prophecies hold up or not, is what their purpose is, right? We can't judge something unless we know what it's made for. I can't judge if a car is a good car or a bad car unless I drive it on the road. If I try and test whether it's a good car by throwing it into the ocean, I'm not going to get any usable data because that's not what it's made for. And the same thing is true of prophecies, right? There are different kinds of prophecies. And the word has a very large meaning. And so it can be difficult to figure out what we mean when we say prophecy. So the thing is that there's many kinds of prophecies. The Bible is full of different kinds of prophecies. We've got apocalyptic prophecies. We've got historical prophecies. We've got partial fulfillment that have later fulfillment prophecies, all that kind of stuff. I've made videos on the relationship between prophecies, specifically about Jesus in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, referring to the New Testament, and the connection between the Old and New Testament, and how the New Testament fulfills the Old Testament. It doesn't abrogate it, etc., etc. If that's interesting to you, please check those videos out or leave a comment. I'm happy to talk about that more. Today, though, we're talking about the Quranic prophecies. So what is the purpose of the Quranic prophecies? I would say the first purpose for the Quran is to bring correction to Christians and Jews. Most mainstream Islamic scholars and Quranic Islamic apologists believe that the Quran is speaking out against the excesses of the current Christians and Jews in the Hijaz at the time of Muhammad, and the corruption of the Bible they've corrupted, so that the Bible at the time of Muhammad has been corrupted, or at least corrupted by some people. That how that worked and what that was is very much up for debate. As a Christian, I would dispute that, of course, but this is what the Muslims would say. And so the Quran is bringing correction. So the Christians, the Bible is saying that Jesus is the Son of God. The Quran specifically denies that. The Bible says that Jesus is divine. The Quran denies that. The Bible says that God is triune. The Quran denies that and says God is Unitarian. And so there are various key elements of the truths of Christianity that are found in the biblical corpus which are denied by the Quran. So the Quran is bringing correction to the Bible. It's not saying the Bible is totally correct in its current form. There's no corruption. There's nothing. It's saying either it's wrong or it's been corrupted in some way. The Jews or Christians have corrupted it. And so the Quran is coming to bring correction. The second thing the Quran is doing is it is coming, or the prophecies in the Quran rather are doing, are they're coming to basically prove that the Quran is itself true. Now, this is a really important point because the Quran did not come accompanied by other signs and wonders. Like, for example, Jesus came with miracles and healings, and he calmed the storm, and then he rose from the dead, which is the greatest miracle, the greatest proof of his divinity. But Muhammad didn't do that. He didn't come doing other external miracles that could be externally verified. The Quran is the miracle, right? Muslims will often call it a mu'ajiza, right? It's a miracle. It is itself the miracle. And so what that means is the prophecies that are in the Quran are the proof for the truth and the divinity, or the source of the Quran being divine. And so this is very significant because what that means is the Quran is using prophecies as a way to convince people who have beliefs that it disagrees with to change their beliefs, to reject those beliefs and accept new beliefs. Right? It's telling Christians, hey, I know you believe that Jesus is God. You should reject that belief, and instead you should accept that he's just a prophet. Why should you trust the Quran over the Bible? Well, here's a prophecy that we can use to show the Quran is definitely the word of God, because only God could have known this particular thing, and therefore this is not just the word of Muhammad or later editors. This is the word of God. And so because of that, the burden of proof falls very much squarely on the prophecies that are in the Quran. There aren't any external miracles or external evidences for the truth of the Quran. All you have are the prophecies, and then of course there are various other elements of the Quran. Some people would talk about the scientific miracles in the Quran, which we won't talk about today. And then other Muslim apologists would talk about the beauty and the style of the Quran, which is not so much a logical argument as much as it is appeal to emotion. But even still, it can be viewed as an argument. And so this means that when we approach the prophecies of the Quran, we really have to have a way to assess them, because they're being used as the capstone or the foundation for the argument for Islam. And so we like any other evidence that may be presented for any other situation, we need a way to judge it and a way to assess whether it's strong evidence or whether it's weak evidence, or whether it's kind of somewhere in between. So how do we know when we're confronted with a Quranic prophecy? How do we judge it? What's our standard? As far as I can tell, there are at least 4 criteria that a prophecy must fulfill in order to pass as a valid evidence or good evidence for any given claim. And so let's go through these 4 criteria, and I'll show why they must be present in order for a prophecy to be a valid piece of evidence. So the first one is that it must be impossible to predict by man at all. So this one is very straightforward, I think. Suppose I were to say, God spoke to me and he told me that next year there will be a day when it rains in London. Well, when that day comes and it rains, and I go up to you and I say, hey, look, I predicted this, I prophesied this, I am clearly hearing from God. What are you going to say to me? Are you going to say, oh yes, clearly you're hearing from God? Or are you going to say, don't be ridiculous, it obviously rains in London all the time. That is very easy to predict. Anyone can predict that it will rain in London sometime next year. So that is something that's very easy to predict, something that happens all the time. And so therefore, because it's so easy to predict, it's not something that can be used as a valid piece of proof that I'm hearing from God. The second criterion is that it needs to be uncontrollable by people. That means the person who's making the prophecy can't have control over the actual prophecy or the actual execution of the event. So if I say to you, I heard from God, and apparently on July 8th in 2025, I'm going to eat a sandwich at 10 p.m. And that day comes, I eat a sandwich at that time, and I come to you and say, see, look, the prophecy came true. I'm a prophet. I'm hearing from God. Again, doesn't work. You can't claim that as evidence because you are the one who's controlling the situation. The third criterion is that it needs to be specific. So you can't just have a general claim. So, if I was to say something like, over the next 10 years, God has told me that humans will harm the earth. Is that good evidence that that I'm hearing from God? No, of course not. That's so general that anyone could predict that. That could mean anything, right? No matter what happens in the next 10 years, I can just interpret that to mean what I said because it's such a general prophecy. This will not function as evidence that I'm really hearing from God. That doesn't work. And the final one, the final criterion that a prophecy needs to have is that it needs to be verifiable externally. So if I were to say, God spoke to me and said, I'm going to have a headache tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning comes by and I say to you, hey, I have a headache. See, I'm a prophet from God. You should believe me. No, that doesn't work. You can't say that because you have no way of verifying whether I have a headache. There's no one else who can verify that, only me. And so unless my prophecies are externally verifiable, they don't count as evidence, because how are you supposed to know, right? I could just be lying. So as far as I can tell, these are the 4 most important components to any given prophecy. I think it's pretty straightforward. I don't think there really is anything controversial about these 4 components, right? If a prophecy is missing any of these, then clearly we can't use it as evidence to prove another point, or as evidence in a deductive argument of some sort, as Muslims do with prophecies in the Quran. So now that we've laid those out, let's analyze the prophecies that are in the Quran that Muslim apologists use to argue for the Quran, and see if these prophecies actually fit all these criteria. So I've got a list of prophecies here in the Quran. I've done my best to try and find all the prophecies I could that Muslims use as evidence for the truth of the Quran. If I missed some, I'm sorry. Please comment below and let me know, and I'll try and address them in a different video. But these are what I found so far, so bear with me. So the first one we've got is from Surah 41, Ayah 20, which says, "Their skins will bear witness against them as to what they have been doing." And this one is supposedly a prophecy of fingerprint technology, that in the future their skins, right, fingerprints will catch them in the act of doing crimes. Now, I think you'll probably be able to see that this violates the criterion of vagueness. It is not specific enough. It doesn't have any specificity. This claim, their skins will bear witness against them, could mean so many different things. This could be referring to any number of real and possible technologies that have or have not yet been invented. And it could also easily be a metaphorical claim. This is not, there's so many ways that your skin could bear witness, right? You could have goosebumps, or you could, be blushing because you're embarrassed over what you've done. So this is not a specific prophecy. It's definitely not specific enough to be claiming that it's talking about fingerprinting. This is eisegesis, reading into a text after the fact rather than reading out of the text. If you just take the Quranic text alone, there's nothing in that verse that would lead you to think about fingerprinting. But if you later on look at fingerprinting and then look back at the text, you could say, I could see how that could fit. But the problem with that methodology is that if you use that, you can find any meaning in any text. Seriously, like, you looking back, you can basically read anything into any text, because texts always have a level of ambiguity. So this violates at least the principle of specificity. It's too vague, doesn't work, not good evidence. Okay, next up we have a few that I'm grouping them together because they all have the same issue, which is very interesting. So the first prophecy is a prophecy that the world will become polluted, that humans will pollute the air, or the world rather, and land and sea, not the air. This is Surah 30, Ayah 41, "Corruption is spread on land and sea, and because of what man's hands have wrought." And another prophecy, this one talking about the establishment of the state of Israel, that Israel will be established as a state. This one comes from 17:104, which says, "And after him we said to the children of Israel, dwell in the promised land, and when the time of the promised latter day comes, we will bring you together out of various peoples." And the third prophecy is talking about roads in the mountains, that in the future men will build roads through difficult mountain ranges. And it says, this is from 81:3, "and when the mountains are made to move." Now, all three of these prophecies are interesting. I would say the way they're talked about in the Quran is very, very vague. I think it definitely violates the specificity criterion. Corruption is spread on land and sea because of what men's hands have wrought. Corruption could mean so many different things. And the same thing, saying that the people will be brought together is a little bit vague too. But there's actually a more important problem, which is that all three of these prophecies are also found in the Bible. The one about people bringing corruption to the land and sea is found in Isaiah 24 and Revelation 6. And a similar prophecy about the Israel becoming a nation is found in Ezekiel 34:13. And a prophecy about people making roads in the mountains, about mountains moving, is found in Matthew 17. And so all three of these prophecies cannot be used to demonstrate the truth of the Quran, because the Quran is bringing correction to the Bible, right? It's not agreeing with everything the Bible is saying. In fact, it's disagreeing on the fundamental truths. And so if these prophecies provide evidence for the truth of the Quran, that means because they also are found in the Bible, they also provide truth for the Bible. But since the Quran and the Bible cannot both be true, they cancel each other out. So all these prophecies are moot. They cancel each other out because they're found both in the Bible and in the Quran. Next up, we have a few prophecies which, to say they're vague is being generous. Let's look at them. So first we have from Surah 4, Ayah 119, "They will alter Allah's creation." Can you guess what that is referring to, supposedly? That's supposed to be referring to genetic engineering. Again, it's not there. That's just not there in the text. That's total eisegesis, not exegesis. This is not good evidence for the Quran's divinity. Also, we have from Surah 16, verse 8, Ayah 8, "And he has created horses and mules and donkeys that you may ride them, and as a source of beauty. And he will create what you do not yet know." This is supposed to be a prophecy of future transportation. Once again, it violates the principle or the criterion of specificity. Way too vague. Of course, in the future, there's going to be modes of transportation that people don't know yet. I can predict that now. That doesn't make me a prophet. So again, way too vague. And then, of course, we also have Surah 81, Ayah 4, and when the wild beasts are gathered together, that's supposed to be a prophecy talking about zoos. Again, violates specificity, way too vague. That could be anything when the wild beasts are gathered together. Wild beasts gather together in all sorts of different ways at different times and places. Who's gathering them? Why are they gathering them? All these things are not stated. This is not a good evidence for the prophecy being from God. Next, we have two more prophecies that are also found in the Bible, which is one, Surah 81, Ayah 7, and when various peoples are brought together. That's supposed to be a reference to modern telecommunication. This is also discussed in Revelation chapter 11. And then also we have Surah 81 verses 8 and 9. And when the female infant buried alive is questioned about that, for what crime was she killed? This is supposedly a prophecy that in the future there'll be women's rights, like more rights for women. And again, this is vague. Both of these two are honestly extremely vague. When the various peoples are brought together is super vague. So they violate the principle of specificity again. But the women's rights one, I think, also can be found in the Bible, where in the first chapters of Genesis, it says that God made women in his own image, just like he made men. And so if women are made in God's image, then it makes sense that, that they should also have rights. So this concept is not totally foreign to the Bible. And so we can see here again, two more examples of if the prophecies make the Quran true, they must also make the Bible true, and that they wash each other out then, because the Quran and the Bible disagree. Next up, we have two more that are also pretty vague. The first one is from Surah 81, Ayah 10, and when the books are spread abroad. Again, this is very vague. I bet you can't guess what this one is supposed to be referencing. The printing press, right? So the printing press, of course, was invented many years after Muhammad, and so the argument is this is referring to that, but this is eisegesis. This is not, obviously, books were spread abroad before the printing press. They just weren't there weren't as many books, and it was much harder to make them, but of course they were spread abroad. So to say that this is only referring to the printing press is ridiculous. And the second one is from Surah 51, Ayah 8, the heavens are, and by the heaven full of tracks. Again, violates the principle of specificity. This is supposed to be referencing air traffic control and air travel. This could be so many things, right? This could be birds flying in the air. This could be heavenly beings flying in the air. This could be referencing, air, like clouds moving through the air. There's so many things this could be referencing, or it could be heavenly bodies like the sun and the stars. So to say that this is air travel, again, is reading into the text. It's definitely not a proof that the Quran is from God. This next prophecy isn't really a prophecy, to be honest. It's I'm being generous by including it in here, but I really shouldn't. This is from Surah 54, Ayah 17. And in truth, we have made the Quran easy to remember. Who then is willing to take it to heart? Now, the claim is that this is a prophecy that says that the Quran will be memorized by many people in the future, but that's actually not what the text says, right? The text does not say, in the future, many people will memorize the Quran. It just says, we have made the Quran easy to memorize, which is not a prophecy, right? That's just saying, we've done something. If I say to you, I made a burger that tastes good, that's not a prophecy. That's not saying a lot of people are going to eat it. So the fact that people memorize the Quran later is great, but that's not something that was predicted in the text itself. So again, not really a prophecy, but it is something I have seen some Muslim apologists argue for. The next two prophecies we're going to talk about I'm lumping together because they're basically the same idea, which is that Muhammad or Allah gives a prophecy that two men will be cast into hell, that they will apostatize and then be cast into hell. The first man is named Walid ibn Mughira. Allah predicts that he will be going to hell. And the second man is Abu Lahab. And Abu Lahab, similarly, Allah says about him that, as we see here in Surah 111, that he has perished, he will be plunged into flaming fire. Now, this, of course, violates the fourth criterion for prophecies, which is the criterion of verifiability. You cannot verify this because the prophecies are that these men will go to hell. Well, how do we know they're going to go to hell? Now, a Muslim might say, and a Muslim has said to me, well, we know they're going to hell because they apostatized. But that's circular reasoning, because you're assuming that people who apostatize from Islam go to hell. But the purpose of these prophecies is to prove that Islam is true. But if Islam isn't true, then people who leave Islam aren't going to hell. So you can't use people leaving Islam as evidence that they're going to hell, because this whole argument is trying to be used as a proof that Islam is a true religion, and if you leave it, you go to hell. So that's circular reasoning. And so because of that, these two prophecies don't work as evidence, independent evidence that the Quran is from God. The next three prophecies are prophecies which I'm going to lump together because, again, they're discussing similar events and have similar problems. So the first one is the defeat of the Meccan army by the Muslim community. This is seen in Surah 45, which says, "Or do they, the Meccan kuffar, say, we are a great multitude and we shall be victorious? Their multitude will be defeated and they shall turn their backs in flight." So here the Quran is predicting that the Muhammad and the Muslim community will defeat the Meccan kuffar, unbelievers. And then we also have the conquest of Khaybar and Mecca. We see this here in Surah 48:27, "That which God inspired in his prophet by means of dreams is true and veracious. Without any doubt, you, prophet, will enter the sacred mosque in Mecca in safety and security. You will shave your heads and shorten your hairs without any fear or anxiety. God knows what you do not know, and you will win a victory near at hand." So this is referring to the safe entry of the Muslim community into Mecca, into the sacred mosque. That will happen with peace and without battle. And finally, we have Muhammad returning to Mecca in general. In Surah 28, God says to him, "God who made you, Muhammad, made incumbent on you the recitation of the Quran will return you to your birthplace." The birthplace of Muhammad, of course, was Mecca, and so that's a promise or a prediction or a prophecy that Muhammad will return to Mecca. Now, all three of these prophecies have the same three issues with them. They violate actually three of the criteria that we have listed for evidentiary prophecy. The first one is controllability. All three of these referring to battles and leadership situations in which Muhammad is the leader. Muhammad was the war leader, the military leader, and the general leader for the Muslim community. And so he had a high degree of control over the events that are being prophesied here. He had a high degree of control over the battle that was being fought against the Meccans, and he had a high degree of control in the manner in which they entered Mecca afterwards, and he had a high degree of control in the general governing of his community. And so to say that this is something totally out of his hands that he couldn't have manipulated or controlled in any way is, of course, ridiculous. Muhammad had a huge amount of control, obviously not total control, but high enough amount of control where it would be naive to just say, well, there's no way that he could have manipulated anything. That's silly. He was the leader. He obviously had a lot of control. The second principle it violates is the principle of predictability. These are predictable events. To say that there's a good chance that we're going to win the next battle, there's a good chance that we're going to be able to enter the city, there's a good chance that we're going to be able to do it, enter the city under certain circumstances. To be able to predict those kind of things is not particularly difficult depending on the context. There are many contexts where these kind of predictions would be child's play. And so just to say that this is somehow necessarily miraculous is just not, it's just not true. There are many scenarios where this could be very easy to predict. Now, a Muslim might respond to me and say, well, yes, but in this context, this was impossible to predict. There were so many Meccans and there were so few in the Islamic community, and the odds were stacked against them, and there's no way that anyone could have predicted this outcome. I would say, okay, but then we run into another issue, which is the criterion of verifiability, that there's no way to verify any of these external facts because this historical event does not have attestation outside of either very late and or biased sources. And so, anyone who's saying any of the information that we have about these battles and about these events is coming filtered through people who had a vested interest in making Muhammad look like the prophet of God. And so we can't trust those accounts. We cannot trust those accounts because there's no external corroborating evidence. There's no neutral party. There's no external party to verify that, oh yeah, there were so many Meccans and so few Medinans and no one could have predicted, but somehow this guy Muhammad made a crazy prophecy. None of that. We don't have any of that. And so we don't have enough historical information or accurate historical information or reliable historical information about the goings on at that time and place in order to say with any degree of certainty that this prophecy is something that could not have been known by someone through natural means. And so because of that, because of the failure of because these prophecies fail on 3 counts, they do not count as prophecies that can be used as evidence for the truth of the Qur'an. So I think we can see that all the prophecies we've discussed so far have been very weak at best. That's being generous. That they do not meet the 4 criteria for what a prophecy needs to be in order to be an evidentiary prophecy, in order for us to ground our beliefs in Islam in those prophecies. They just don't pass the test. However, there's one more prophecy to discuss, and that is the best candidate in the Quran for a legitimate evidentiary prophecy, and that is, of course, Surah 30, ayahs 2 to 5. This is a historical event contemporaneous to the Quran or close to contemporaneous to the Quran, which we have plenty of attestation and evidence for from external sources. And so this is something that we can actually test. So let's put that to the test. So we have here Surah 30. The Romans have been vanquished in the nearer part of the land, and after their vanquishing they shall be the victors in a few years. To God belongs the command before and after, and on that day, and the believers shall rejoice in God's help. God helps whomsoever he will, and he is the Almighty, the All-Compassionate. Now, the claim here is that this is a prophecy referring to the war that was occurring between the Byzantine Romans and the Sassanid Persian Empire. And what had happened was the Persians had pushed the Byzantines all the way back to Constantinople, and it looked like victory was surely at hand for the Persians. But then, against all odds, Emperor Heraclius launched a counterattack against the Persians and pushed them all the way back to Ctesiphon, their capital, and ended up toppling Khosrow, the emperor of the Sassanid Empire, and his son came to power and sued for peace. And so basically the claim is at the time of this prophecy, the Romans were about to be defeated. Then the prophecy from Muhammad came that the Romans will end up winning, and then shortly thereafter the counteroffensive went off and the Romans, against all odds, defeated the Persians. Now, there are a few issues with this, and various scholars have written on this, including Tommaso Tessé, and these scholars make several points. So the first point is there is a big textual issue here. As I'm sure you know, when it comes to ancient Semitic languages, manuscripts in the ancient languages, we often do not have vowel pointings for them. Even modern day Arabic and Hebrew are written without vowel pointings because you don't really need them. And especially so for Quranic manuscripts and biblical manuscripts, there's no vowel pointings. Well, the problem is that there are many times where the vowel pointings change the meaning of the verb very much. And so depending on which vowel, that's going to change the tense aspect or mood of the verb. And so this is what is happening here. So for example, the traditional qira'ah reading of this verse is غُلِبَتِ الرُّومُ وَسَيَغْلِبُونَ, right? غُلِبَتِ الرُّومُ, like the Romans have been vanquished. غُلِبَتْ, as they've been vanquished. سَيَغْلِبُونَ, and they will conquer. That's the traditional qira'ah. That's the traditional reading. However, there's a secondary reading that just changes the vowels, and that is غَلَبَتَ الرُّومُ and سَيُغْلَبُونَ. So the first one is غَلِبَتَ الرُّومُ versus غَلَبَتَ الرُّومُ. So the second one means غَلَبَتَ الرُّومُ is the Romans have vanquished, the Romans have conquered, and سَيُغْلَبُونَ, and they will be conquered. So the first option is the Romans have been conquered, but they will conquer. And the second option is the Romans have already conquered, but they will be conquered. So you see the problem there, right? Those are opposite claims. Those are totally opposite claims. And the only difference is between the vowel pointings, which we don't have in the oldest manuscripts. We don't have the vowel pointings. So what do we do about this? Well, there's a very deep rabbit hole to go into in terms of how we can determine which qira'ah is correct, and how we assess different qira'at, and that is a wormhole that maybe I'll go into someday. Like I said, I constantly say I'm not an expert. I'm a student learning just like all of us, but at the very least we can see here this is a big textual issue because basically it makes this prophecy true no matter what happens, right? Like, and you could say, well, we have the tradition, right? We have the tradition, the oral tradition passed down. But the problem is that oral tradition took place after this battle happened, right? So you have the battle, you have the prophecy being given, then you have the battle shifting and the Persians being defeated. And then you have the Quran is still oral, and then you have the oral tradition being passed down. You're telling me that I'm supposed to trust that the followers of Muhammad, who had a vested interest in making him seem like a prophet of God, for their own sake, that they might not have, slightly played with the vowels here to make it work out for them, to make it look like this was a real prophecy, like that may not have happened, or it may have happened, but you cannot reasonably expect people to trust in your religion based on the good character of a few people 1,000 years ago. That is not good evidence, right? You might particularly as a Muslim, have great respect for the Sahaba and for all the people in the early Islamic community, and that they would have never changed anything. But I'm sorry, that is an insider perspective. As an outsider, I have no reason to trust those people. So you need to give evidence that is beyond, oh yeah, they would never have changed that. That is not good enough evidence. So that's the first issue, huge textual issue of what is this even saying? Is this even claiming that the Romans will end up conquering the Persians? The second issue, of course, is this issue of verifiability of the timeline. The timeline is crucial here, right? When exactly the ayah came down, and when exactly the battle took place, and when exactly the tide shifted is hugely important, right? Even if the battle, even if the timeline is off by a few years, then we already have a problem where it could have been that, the tide had already shifted, and then Muhammad gives the prophecy, but it was already clear who was going to win. So that's a big issue, is can we verify the exact time when the ayah was revealed? I don't think we can. Again, our sources are Islamic, and so they're biased and they're late. So that's all I've got for prophecies. If you know of more, please let me know, like I said, and I'll try and address them. But this is something that we really need to talk about, because as far as I can tell, these prophecies do not pass the test for what an evidentiary prophecy needs to be in order to be justified, for a person to be justified in using that as the foundation for their belief in Islam. They just does not pass the four criteria. And because of that, we're just not justified in trusting the Quran on that basis. Now, a couple things to say. First of all, I'm sure I can probably hear you from your computer screens yelling, but what about the biblical prophecies? What about them? Why are you picking on the Quranic prophecies? And I'll just say one thing. This is a key difference between the biblical prophecies and the Quranic prophecies. The biblical prophecies are not there to try and prove that the Bible is from God, or that Jesus was the Son of God, or any of the core claims. No, they are not the central proof. They are supporting evidence. It would be kind of like the difference between, in a court case, the prophecies in the Bible are more like character witnesses, which is something that confirms or gives credence to a theory that you already present. But it's not the central case. It's not the central evidence of the case. You can't convict someone just on character witnesses alone. Whereas the Quranic prophecies are used as the central case, right? That would be the equivalent of like the videotape of the crime occurring. That's where the whole case is being tried, is on the prophecies in this case. So this is a huge difference between the two of them. Why is that difference there? Because for Christians, our central claim is that Jesus rose from the dead. That is our proof for all his other claims. That our greatest piece of evidence is his resurrection from the dead. If that is true, then that validates all of his claims about his divinity, about what he says is true about God, etc., etc. There's an external event that we can point to and say, if that event is historically true, then the Bible is true. At least the New Testament is true. And so if because that's the case, the prophecies in the Bible are not, we don't lean on them to provide that evidence. And in fact, that's not what they're for. The prophecies in the Bible are not there to try and convince unbelievers to become believers or to change their beliefs. No. The prophecies that are in the Bible are there to show people who already believe in the Old Testament that that Jesus fits with the Old Testament, that he's fulfilling the Old Testament. He's not changing or abrogating or correcting it. He's just fulfilling it. And so that is so different than what the Qur'an is doing. The Qur'an is going into a Christian and Jewish context and saying, you guys have all these beliefs, but no, these beliefs are wrong. Jesus is not God. God is not triune. You need to reject these beliefs and accept these different beliefs instead. Why should you believe these things? Why should you change your beliefs? Well, because the Quran is from God. How do we know it's from God? Is there some external piece of evidence? No, there's no external evidence. It's just the Quran itself is the evidence that it's from God. And one of the key elements of that evidence is that there are all these prophecies that are supposedly found in the Quran that are in and of themselves proof of its divinity. So you see that there's a totally different usage for prophecies in the Bible and the Quran. That's why the Quran has prophecies. That's why the prophecies in the Quran must be held to this high standard, because their evidence is that is the evidence. If all the prophecies in the Bible were found to be false, if every single one were false, that would do nothing to eliminate the truth of the Bible. That would just show that, that would remove one piece of evidence, but it wouldn't come close to removing the core piece of evidence, which is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And so, whereas if all the prophecies in the Quran were proved to be false and invalid, then I think that does do a huge amount of damage to the Muslim claim that the Quran is from God. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Christian Dawah, and I pray that the Lord blesses you, and I hope you have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.